You're a little early.
I guess so.
There are people hearing us having a good time by this show. They're starting to come on.
They're popping. That's
right. I don't know if we're
getting their cup of coffee. They're settling into an incredible session of education and information.
We have a good opening music.
Here we go. Live from New York, from the Battle of the Quants Wall Street television studio, it's Battle Focus. And we have an exciting program today, but what about the news? I mean, this is amazing. The Hong Kong Stock Exchange has put a bid out for over $36 billion to purchase the London Stock Exchange, but they've got to divest of Refinitiv. In the age of data, that's unbelievable. Hard to believe, but we're going to return to that because we're also going to talk a little bit about Hong Kong and what's happening over there and the Battle of the Quants Hong Kong coming up on October 15th. But before we do, let me introduce my guest, Rob Passarella with Socialgist. And we've got an exciting program talking about structuring of data in order so that you can figure out predictability. Now, let's get right into it, Rob.
Let's go, Bart.
You have been on all sides of the data world. You've been on the hedge fund side, you've been on the data buying side, you've been on the data selling side, you've been over at Bloomberg, you've been over at Protege, you've been multiple places.
You make me sound like an arms dealer, Bart. Well, I've been on many sides.
Yeah, right. You've seen it all. Always take the middle road. I would like to ask you, where did all this start? What did you see in the beginning, and where are we today? Could you give us a little synopsis of what you've seen from both angles?
You know, Bart, I kind of thought about this a little. I've known you probably for 15 years now, so I'm hearing a lot about alternative data these days. But
so am I.
Yeah.
That's why we changed Battle of the Quants to Battle of the Quants Big Data.
But it's really funny. If I go back and I think about 15 years when 15 years when I met you, 2004.
Back in London.
We were doing things which today would be considered, alternative data, right? We were, scraping data right from websites and putting it together, trying to figure out how to unpack, top selling items at Amazon. In fact, even before that, in the equity research space, I spent a lot of time at Morgan Stanley, and that is we were doing an ancient thing called channel checking, right? That's where if you wanted to figure out what latest price was for a product or what was selling, you'd have all the junior analysts run around and call up all these stores and say, hey, how many do you have left in inventory? Did you sell them all? So that I'd say is... that
was a manual process that lasted quite a while.
Yeah, it is, but if you think about it, that's the natural progression of where we are today, right? And we're gonna get into more of that, I think.
Yep.
But, back then is, I guess this stuff comes in waves, maybe? So, I know you just called me old by saying I've been around for a while, but I've seen quite a few waves. And
I guess that makes me old, too.
It makes you older, I think. I think it makes you older.
All right, so you were basically doing all this channel checking, so you were actually working with alternative data.
We didn't call it that. We didn't call it. I think actually what we called it mostly was web data, or we said, we got a little fancy. We called it unstructured data. Alternative is it's a nice branding phrase. I think I like alternative bands, alternative data. It's a really good branding phrase when you think about it.
Yeah, but it's been around, and it's only recent that people think that it actually was branded in that way. But it really has been around for quite a while in at least a manual process. But what's interesting is
you could go way back and say if you looked at Tiger and Julian Robinson and all this stuff and sending people down to docks to actually watch ships come in and count containers, that might have been the first alternative data. Right?
Fair enough. But because of the limited resources, you asked the question first, and then you backed it up with the data by making all the calls, versus gathering tons and tons of data, storing it on ASW, and then having your quants query it. So, can you tell us a little bit about the fundamental traders, which is what you were referring to, versus the quantitative traders, and how those two relate?
So
since Battle of the Quants, we got to bring in the quants, right?
Yeah, I think the best way to describe this is kind of what's happened with how people think about the investment process and research, right? We've gotten into a point where it's data everywhere, right? And I have so much data, I can't drink it all at once, right? Which is what I would say is the first wave of really the quant side of data, which is give me as much data and I'll figure out and find a signal. I'll do all the searches in that.
You do the correlations.
I'll do all the correlations. I'll try to figure that out, right? Versus the fundamental side, which is really thinking about is, I know how businesses operate. I have an expertise in what that business and that industry, and I want to figure out, given the questions I have, how could I look at that company differently, or what do I want to look at? And those are the two ends of the spectrum. And they've kind of started to come together, and what's really made them come together is this thought about, one, well, returns have made them come together because it's a very competitive environment, but the obvious thing is that the amount of data that's out there to take a look at and want to actually use as part of that investment process has grown, and grown tremendously, right? So when you take it from that angle, that's what's happened, right? Is like the quant guys have been digging in this data, and I don't want to say running out of questions, right? But they've looked at it as more of a mathematical exercise in some cases, and the fundamental guys have always looked at it as a question, and now they're finding unique data. So we're kind of moving to a world where they're merging.
Okay, so, but we talked earlier, and we talked about how a lot of the quants, and I know I've talked to many quant managers who say they basically buy every piece of data that's out there, they put it up on ASW, they index it, and then they make it available to their quant guys. And the quant guys sift through it, and then they find correlations, they find predictability, etc. Versus the fundamental guys who are trying to answer a question and very specifically go after and identify the data set they want and then search it.
Do you not want to give a plug to Amazon? It's AWS, just letting you know. It's ASW's
wasn't that your last company?
Maybe. ASW's anti-submarine warfare, just for everybody out there. So we're not doing that, even though we're hiding data sets somewhere. So I think what we're seeing is there was a trend sort of in the early waves of this, is what I call building haystacks.
Okay.
Which is, you had tons and tons of firms going out buying as much data they could without rhyme or reason, just because they wanted to accumulate the data, and they wanted to build a haystack, and then they wanted to figure out, could they find needles in the haystack that they built, right?
That provide predictability or some kind of correlation that can be traded in a mathematical algorithm.
They didn't know the size or the shape of the needle, right? But they had this tremendous haystack that they were building, right? And I think that's a wave that you saw where, and rightly or wrongly in any, accumulating data was probably a good idea in those phases, because a lot of it was falling on the floor, right? If you think about it, and we've gotten to the point where everybody is realizing now the data that they have, they'd love to be able to monetize it, right? That's another thing that's come in. So I think that wave is kind of over about accumulating data. We've seen that, and that's kind of subsided. And now it's really, and this is what I was talking about before, it's about asking a question and finding the data that I think could help me answer that question. And I think both sides are doing that, whether it's fundamentals or quantitative guys.
Okay, so let's get into the core of what we want to talk about, which is structuring data for predictability. So could you tell us a little bit about how to structure data in order to identify it and then pull out what's going to determine which way the market moves for the traders? So let's talk about the predictability of data and a platform that you can establish in order to provide that predictability.
So you have to think about this, if we take a step back for a second, is that, and think about what anybody uses in this space. They use data that's highly structured, and actually the data is very well lined up to a lot of the price data that we want to use. So I'm actually going to call that classic data. If you think about the things that come from a Bloomberg or Refinitiv or a FactSet or a CapIQ, that's classic data. That's
traditional data.
Traditional. Okay. I like to call it classic. I'm a new Coke, old Coke kind of guy, so I like classic Coke. We'll call it that.
Let's do that.
Right. So if you take it from that point of view,
you heard it here first.
Yeah, you heard it here first. Classic data, right? If you've got alternative, you've got classic.
Right.
So the changeover that's really had to happen is that as we started to think about data sets that were not classic and not lined up, is that they were totally devoid of any structure to be able to use with the systems they have. So for example, you have the greatest price database as a hedge fund. You have an amazing price and asset database that's out there that has all the indicative factors you need, all the quantitative factors you need. And now you want to take something like credit card receipts, and you want to start mapping purchases, not of individuals, but of products and companies, right?
Anonymized, of course.
Anonymized, of course, but the idea is like, that data is not mapped to a company that you can actually use, right? You have to go, if you wanted to figure out that I bought something at a Starbucks, all that mapping of the credit card transaction has to be translated into not only a ticker, but the standard identifiers like a QSIP or an ISIN, right?
The metadata.
The metadata that's there.
Sure.
And so that is a huge part of taking any data set these days. And that's the biggest difference between the alternative side and what I'll call the classic, is that the classic already comes basically ready-made and understands things like point in time, understands basically securities identifiers, whereas the alternative doesn't.
Yeah.
You have work to do, and that has shifted the sort of what's happened in this world, because quantitative researchers now have had to become data engineers in cleaning and actually making data to line it up.
Right.
And they spend a significant part of their time doing that as part of that process.
But I think what's really interesting, and I saw a presentation yesterday at the Ravenpack conference where they had traditional or classic data, which is somewhat benign and really does have predictability. But then when you get into the alternative data, you start to have what's called wicked data, where, and maybe that's...
Is that Massachusetts thing? It's wicked data, cool beans, baby?
Yeah, it's showing you something, but it's not actually going to happen. And maybe that's part of the complexity where alternative data can be wicked data, and you have to put a lot more data engineering behind it in order to define specific predictability.
I know Ravenpack very well. Armando is awesome, right? Armando's the CEO. He's stuck with this for quite some time, and I would say is, maybe in this phase is a lot of us were very early, and now because we spent so much time being early in this space, we had the ideas maybe 8 to 10 years ago and some of this, and we're starting to see. I think that's it. It's really making the data in a format that's malleable to use. And the only way we can do that in finance is we have to line it up to something. And the only thing we line it up to is asset data, price data, right? Volume data. Those are the things at the end of the day that are going to give us what we want, which is a measure of predictability. We're trying to predict asset prices, right? That's what we're trying to do at the end of the day. Whether we start at looking at revenues or EPS or earnings, wherever you want, at the end of the day, you want to be able to say, in the future, this will be worth X, right? So you need to have the X. You need to have whatever that asset is, and the price is historically for that asset.
So so it needs to be structured in order to provide for predictability, and that's the data engineering part. That's why these guys are getting paid all the money.
But
that's a lot of what you are doing now at Socialgist, is this platforming and establishing a structure to allow for predictability.
Let me explain a little bit more about Socialgist and what we did. So Socialgist is not new. Socialgist has been around for almost 20 years.
Right.
We started in the internet space. And really the founder, Scott Purdon, in this case, is what he did was he recognizes that people wanted to actually derive a lot of insight from the data that was there, whether it was web scraping or message boards, that's prehistory, and put it together and actually figure out how to publish it on a regular basis for people. So that allowed a ton of people now, what we call the social listening space or the advertising brand space, to be able to ingest and use that information. So in this wave, if you think about any company today that wants to really evaluate, understand their brand or their products on social media or in any user-generated content, they need to get that content and they need to get it consistently. So what Socialgist over the years was, we built a way to publish that data to people for them to use. What's changed since I came onto Socialgist is that we've looked and focused pretty much on the space of the problem of what's happening with alternative data and social media data specifically with finance. And one of the keys is that the data, in order to be useful, has to be organized for finance. And the way you organize that for finance is to actually put structure, which is identify the entities, identify the products and brands, and then roll that up to mappings of companies and identifiers. You have to do that. And that's just a normal thing that everyone needs, whether you're finance or beyond. You have to have a structuring to be able to make the data useful.
I understand. Okay, so are you coming out with a white paper that describes this structuring, or is that something that you're going to be presenting at the Battle of the Quants Hong Kong on October 15th?
Well,
got to throw the plug in.
Yes, you listen. Hey Bart, if you don't plug, you don't live, right? You don't eat.
Yeah.
So we all know that.
And
Everybody
obviously
plugs
I'm losing
something,
weight,
right?
so it's tough.
Yes. So what we're doing in Hong Kong is two things. Is we're presenting obviously at Battle. We're doing that. We're doing for an investment bank for their clients. We're doing a couple of sessions there to talk about just data. We're taking a look at Chinese social media data in this case, and actually.
Well, that's interesting because most of the hedge funds, a lot of the quant funds based in Hong Kong, are trading China A shares. The Singaporean basically are trading the world because they're more of a wealth management entity. But Hong Kong is a lot of A shares trading. So this is actually perfect for a lot of the Hong Kong guys.
So we're looking right now at where our white paper, we're working with two partners to do this. One is IQ Banker, which does supply chain information that's there. Calculated Systems is our other partner, which is working on actually doing processing of messages and us to identify all the entities. And really what we're looking at is sort of social media volume around in China, and understanding is how it affects and what it does with products and this is specifically in the context of market share, right? So phone market share, if you will, what determines that within social media and what can use that, and how could that affect the relationships not only for companies but in the supply chain?
Okay.
All right. So this is once again, back to your point, that's the question. We knew that there was data out there. We had access to the data. We worked with some partners, and that's what we're talking about in Hong Kong right now. And the white paper is actually being put together that way.
Okay. So moving back to my original sort of blast about what's going on in the industry, the Hong Kong exchange wants to buy the London Stock Exchange for $36 billion, and interesting caveat, they want the London Stock Exchange to divest of Refinitiv. In the age of the demand of so much data, why do they want to buy an entity and then get rid of what I would consider like the crown jewels, which is an incredible massive data that's been accumulated in the United States for so long? Why do they want to get rid of Refinitiv when they buy London? And by the way, I don't know if that's going to happen, because I remember the days when the Singapore exchange had a new leader, and they were buying neighboring exchange, and they tried to buy the ASX, and the ASX said, no, that's a sovereign entity. Singapore, you're not going to buy the ASX, and it fell to the wayside. I'm wondering, this is somewhat similar.
Before I answer
What's different is the data part.
Before I just want to remind everybody. So we're taking questions. This is the internet.
Oh yeah, we are taking.
Right. You can put some questions in if you like. I think on this one alone, Bart, is what's puzzling to me is that if you look at what's happened to exchanges over the years with fragmentation, is that their business model has changed. Right. It used to be in the early days into the 90s rolling up, it was all about listings. Right, and it was about basically you wanted to get the number of listings to come through your exchange, right, and that was the key.
And you get the volume,
you get the volume and the trading,
per
right?
Trade, yeah.
You know, Reg NMS in the United States basically changed that, right, with sort of you can trade anywhere, right? The law of one price across all markets that's there. So if
there's no advantage to trading on one exchange versus another.
If you were listed on the NYSE and you wanted to trade someplace else, right, it had to be basically, for the most part, the trading is equal at that point.
Same pricing.
So there was no price mechanics to say I should be just trading here at the NYSE
because they give me the best deal. Yeah.
Right. So what's changing that is that the exchanges have had to look at other business opportunities, and what they have still is market data, and from their market data networks and what they do is they've realized that delivery of data, they're really good at it.
Yeah.
And that's a business for them. Right, so for me to look at this, the LSE clearly buying Refinitiv is a great data deal. The LSE says, what we want to do is, Refinitiv and the data is the real reason. That's the future. We have we have a great network. We have
and they
so
sell
many
the
clients.
data to the clients.
We will
basically
do this and probably put pressure on everybody else who license the data.
Sure.
I would read that as all the other vendors that are out there, like the
and
Bloombergs,
NASDAQ buying Quandl is the same thing.
Yeah, so I would say the Cap IQs, the FactSets, anybody who's getting real-time data from an exchange is probably going to be paying a lot more if that deal goes through, I would think, because that's the holdup that they're going to have. But if we look at this more closely, it's about the data and the data network. So LSE buying Refinitiv, they're buying it for the right reasons in my point of view, right? For the Hong Kong exchange to want to buy LSE and get rid of Refinitiv, that just doesn't make sense to me.
Right.
Right. It's about the data. We know that. We know that the future is data. Yeah.
Very interesting.
That's not that it's the new oil. I think that's kind of crazy. I know we all say that. That's a big part that comes out. We all want to say that data is the new oil, and I've said it quite a few times. I always say is then we should probably look at the oil industry to tell us about data. And then.
Well, look, it's going from $1 billion a year in data purchases to $1.7 billion a year in data purchases, and yet only 2% of that data has actually been analyzed, and it's growing at an exponential rate. I mean, the amount of data that's available in the marketplace. We've all heard the 18 months is all the data that's 90% of the data was created in 18 months. 2% is being analyzed. But it's the IoT devices and the sensors that are going to throw a lot more data into the haystack, if you will. And the question is, do you just keep loading it up on AWS, or do you come from an approach which is more of a fundamental approach that says what we talked about earlier, is you ask the question and then you try to support an answer with the data.
Both sides are coming about questions now. It's about questions and testing. But
so you got the questions and the haystack coming together.
But you bring up an interesting point, right? And this goes back to it, is about only 2% of this data is being analyzed.
Right.
I'm just thinking back. I've been around for a while, as you mentioned various times. I've been around for a while,
yes,
and
you
I'm
have
old.
been. Oh my God, forever.
Right. So in the early days when I was at Morgan Stanley, when we thought about Unix, right, every application we wrote would kick out a log. We'd have tons and tons of log data. I don't think we ever read any of that log data, right, or analyzed that log data. Nowadays, I would kill for log data like that.
Sure.
That's what's happening, right, is just about every application is throwing off, euphemistically, I guess, or maybe non-euphemistically, it's exhaust data. But every application is throwing off data, and what's happening is that, yes, everyone wants it and wants to analyze it, but these organizations, and I deal primarily with a lot of hedge funds, is they just don't have the bandwidth to do these things, so they need to be able to prioritize, right? Think about it. You want to analyze 100 data sets. I think on average, it's 2 to 3 months for each data set. That's a lot of time. You need a lot of people to go through that. So that's why, trying to get through this, and there's a winning ring problem. If you think about how people do this data thing, at a modern hedge fund, right? There's really 4 types of things that have to go on. There's discovery. Right, there's the evaluation.
What's the value?
Right,
Yep.
is kind of, there's the compliance piece, which a lot of people don't understand, is that investment organizations spend a lot of time in compliance, making sure that the data that they get, there is a right to give that data and distribute and license that data.
Right, and I think 18 people have to have access to that data. It can't be just you.
I don't know specifically, and I can't comment on that, but I would say is that the difference that's happened is that there's a lot more stringency in looking at these things when it comes to licensing data from somebody, whether it's alternative, and they're there. Those processes are there. I've seen plenty of data due diligence questions in my lifetime now. Right.
Got it. So,
and I'm sorry. The last thing, of course, is the purchase itself. Right?
The purchase itself.
Those are the 4 things that they all have to do.
And what is in other words, what is the value of data, which depends on who else has it, how quickly you get it, and whether or not it's relevant to your trading strategy. But that's a whole nother session that we can go into.
It is, Bart. It is. But you have to always remember with data, there's 2 parts to that curve, right? It's like I'm in a small group of people, and there's enough within my capacity within my strategy to use that data where I can make returns, versus where you get to the belly of that, where the capacity kind of dries up, and really then you get to is like lots of people have it, and I can't get away from it, because if I'm the one guy who doesn't have it and 5 other guys have it, even though everybody's at equal footing, I'm out of the dark and I can't trade that.
So you got to have table stakes. You got to be.
That's what usually happens. Really good data sets wind up becoming table stakes.
Yep.
I would say that.
Right. Now, I'd like to kind of bring this towards conclusion, and then what I'd like you to tell us is, and I love asking this question, is where do you see the market going? Now, obviously, we're seeing exchanges sort of stepping up to the plate and putting a lot of money into data. And are all the data companies going to be basically bought out by the exchanges because they have the money and they need another source of revenue by selling the data? What are some of the consolidations that are taking place? Where do you see any movement, or where are we going in the next 5 years?
I think it's most people may think I'm nuts, but I think it's a very exciting time to think about finance for a lot of reasons. In the institutional space is completely changing, right?
Sure.
We've talked about, at least as an industry, what passive investing has done, right? But once you get volatility into these markets, which we've seen, right? JP Morgan put out the Vol-Fefe index yesterday, or the day before. Everybody's been talking about that.
Because of the tweets from
right. So
Donald Trump.
Once you think about these things, right, is so from one aspect,
driving markets more than fundamentals and more than the quant models and the factor models is crazy.
That's true. So the institutional side, I think it's exciting because we're seeing a shift back over to where active investing means something for a portion of the world, and people are interested again in active investing. I think I saw, for the most part, is that intake from hedge funds has been really good, right, in that case. But what I also find interesting is that there's a change that's going on in retail as well. We're starting to see, what I would call the pro-am in retail. We're starting to see people who are thinking about trading and other things and using information and platforms. So there's platforms like, if you haven't seen it, Koifin is amazing, right? It is kind of like a Bloomberg for those of us who don't spend $2,000 a month on a Bloomberg. right, with the amount of charting that's out there and packages and what they're doing. There was a conference that took place in Arizona called WealthStack, which I was looking at, and just amazed at what's happening in the advisor space, right? So about the information they use, how they use social media, how they work with their clients that way. So I think this is a tremendous time where not only data, but just people have decided how they want to interact in finance. That's changing, and how they actually interact with investors is changing.
There was a report how a quant platform for quantitative analysts was launched in China, and within 24 hours there were 180,000 people that had registered to put their algos onto this platform and trade. Are we going to take any questions? Okay, so we're not going to take any questions this time. Still early days in Battle Focus and the Battle of the Quants television studio here in New York City. But are there any final words that you would like to impart on our virtual audience out there?
I think the best thing that you can do right now, if you're a fan of what's going on and you're in the middle of this market,
come to the Battle of the Quants.
Well, obviously that's
big data.
Let's make another plug for Battle of the Quants in Hong Kong.
It doesn't stop.
It never stops the plug. But the biggest thing you can do right now is just pay attention and have fun. There's a lot of stuff coming down the pipe. There's a lot of things that are happening. It's exciting. It's exciting to watch this space. I have been in it a while, and I'm always amazed at what happens. I'm always amazed. Is every day there's something. I mean, there's a free brokerage now, another one coming out from StockTwits, right? Yeah. StockTwits is offering a free brokerage.
Like
and that's
Robinhood.
I can't wait to see what happens because that actually has a user community. So that's what I mean. There's a lot happening out there in the finance space. It isn't just on the institutional side, but I think that's where it flows from. Okay. That is where it flows. The things we see in the institutional first flow down to everywhere else.
So it's an exciting world. It's interesting.
Yeah.
And a lot of fun. And hopefully this was valuable to our listening audience and our viewing audience. And again, live from New York, from the Battle of the Quants television studio, I now conclude the first Battle Focus session. Thank you,
Thanks,
Robert
Mark.
Passarella from Socialgist.
Thanks.
Take care.
See you in Hong Kong.
Signing off. See you in Hong Kong.